the state of the Russian economy, which is my great hope for how Russia collapses, I think that Vladimir Putin is becoming increasingly pressured by the situation. Currently, 11% of people who have credit cards in Russia have defaulted on them or have stopped paying their bills. And the analysts in Russia say that this is just the beginning and it seems that it's accelerating. And these are creating, once again, trickle down effect of one bad decision to the next bad decision. This can create a cascading effect of collapse, a systemic failure within the entire Russian economy. This exact reasons why Ukraine is attacking across Russia. It changes everything. It does provide a paradigm shift.
This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everybody? Right now, we've just had the NATO Summit 2025. Iran and Israel seems to have, well, I'll never say the term settled down, but there is a fragile ceasefire holding. And so attention is returning to the broader situation between Ukraine, Russia, Europe, the US. And well, in the aftermath of the NATO alliance, I made a video acknowledging the fact that Trump seemed to be coming round again. I'm not sure how many times he's vacillated between being more opposed to NATO and being more on the side of Ukraine and vice versa. But to make sense of that with me is longstanding friend and returning colleague of the channel, Jason J. Smart, chief correspondent at the Kia Post and prolific YouTuber as well. Jason, lovely to have you back after a couple of weeks since. And, well, I mean, should we start with NATO? What's your assessment of how the summit went in the past couple of days?
Well, the summit was very interesting. I'm surprised that they reached, it seems like, the 5% of GDP that they're going to spend on NATO. That's a good sign. I think that also the reception that Zelensky got was positive. And it does seem that Trump is warmer to NATO now than he was, well, certainly warmer than he was during his first term. And where that's going is going to be interesting. But overall, I think that it's a very good sign for Ukraine if we're trying to look at this from the Ukrainian perspective.
Indeed, it's been quite a positive, I think, situation. Although MAGA supporters and people anti-Zelensky were quickly to point out that he was wearing a suit for the first time in ages, and he made an appearance in London here at Chatham House, which I was going to go to, but they were sold out quite quickly, obviously. But do you think that the Europeans are actually going to commit to this 5%, or it's, well, a pipe dream and it's all just political performance and substance is still yet to be there?
Well, it seems that most of the countries are on board. Spain is the most obvious country that's not, but otherwise it does seem like they're on board. And I think that overall it's also a very good sign. I mean, this is something that was necessary already a long time ago. Unfortunately, I think that the European countries for many years were too dependent on the United States, but now it's very clear that the United States is not necessarily a reliable partner, and they have to prepare for their own security. Moving in that direction is quite wise. I mean, I think NATO overall is the role of it, the importance of it is becoming increasingly clear. I've known people who are working in NATO. Actually, I know the guy who's the head of the NATO office in Moscow back in the early 2000s, and another guy in the 90s. And they were all saying back then there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not NATO is necessary. Maybe NATO should just sort of disband or become a relic of the past because there's never going to be another conflict in Europe, especially following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But now today, I think there's far fewer people making that argument. There is always the real potential of conflict in Europe. And it's something that today the Baltic States especially are preparing for, because it does appear that there could be actual tension or actually Russian involvement in what occurs in the Baltic States in the immediate future.
Yes, I agree. You mentioned before we got on air, and something we've both been tracking is obviously the various amount of exercises, drills that seem to occur around this time of the year. If I recall correctly, about this time last year, there was a notable focus on the Belarusian ones because a lot of Chinese troops, well, they say a lot, I think it was about 150, 300, partook in it. But obviously that was suddenly picked up in a lot of Western media as being sort of a deeper illustration that China's willing to get more involved. I think it was slightly blown out of proportion. But, you know, this is going to be occurring, in September, and that obviously gets the Baltic States. There's a PAD, is the largest joint strategic war game by the Belarusian armed forces, as they call it. So you're heading to the Baltic soon, and what are you expecting to hear?
So I'm going, yes, to the Baltics tomorrow, actually. And I'm very interested to see what is going on there. I've got a lot of friends who are working in the governments there and working in various different ministries, as well as elected officials. And I'm very curious what they say is going on, what the feeling is on the ground. But my general sense would be that it is not wholly irrational what they're saying. It actually makes a lot of sense. It's something that Chancellor Merz made reference to just the other day. He said that for too long we've been ignoring the Baltic states or trying to downplay what they say. But in fact, there's a lot going on. And he's right, because if you think of this in the perspective of Putin or
Hmm.
Russia, obviously I don't think Vladimir Putin wants a full scale war with NATO. He's not totally delusional. But that being said, to do something to bypass, or I should say trespass, NATO's rules, that is, let's say, invade a village inside of Lithuania, hold it for a couple days, and then withdraw back to Russia, it could serve a lot of positive purposes for Putin, I think, in his perspective, because currently he's sort of stuck. Right now, what's happening inside of Ukraine is not beneficial to him. So he needs a game changer. He needs something to create a paradigm shift. And the means of creating that within Ukraine itself are impossible. I mean, every day there's more drone attacks, there's more missile attacks, there's more charging on the battlefield. But does that really advance Russia? Does that make victory any closer? And it doesn't. Russia's no closer today to victory than it was a month ago. Nothing has changed. Absolutely nothing has changed. 3.5 years, and nothing has changed. And so, where Russia could actually change things, though, is just imagine this. Let's imagine they rolled into some village in Lithuania or Estonia and held a village that's depopulated or has a couple hundred people, and they were there for a couple of days. Now, there's a couple of things that would happen. One, obviously, the Baltic states and Northern Europe would go absolutely ballistic, but secondly, he would be able to distract from all the assistance going to Ukraine, because which country in Europe is going to at that point say we should continue sending aid to Ukraine? In fact, they'd say no, we have to keep our aid, our arms for our own selves, especially air defense, which Ukraine most critically needs at this moment, is specifically air defense. The Baltic states have been the most helpful out of all the countries per capita in the amount of aid they give to Ukraine. But they would at that point have a very legitimate reason, not out of being cheap, but because simply they cannot afford to give Ukraine more assistance because they need it. They have now a present threat. They have the real clear ambitions of Putin before their own eyes. So they would probably not send as much assistance. That's one. Two, I think that NATO would take time to respond. I mean, even the Baltic states and their national security policies to respond to aggression by Russia is to essentially turn into sort of partisan units to break down, because they would not confront the Russian military as a normal army, because there's just not enough people and not enough equipment. What they would instead do is they would break down and just create a war against Russia from the sides and wait for NATO to finally come and respond. But that's to take weeks. If this is done in less than 48 hours, it would have the demonstrative purpose that it has, the show that it has that distracts NATO, but it would not lead to an actual direct conflict with NATO. I mean, there's no countries in Europe who would respond within, let's say, 24 hours. I mean, Poland would happily help, I have no doubt. But the reality, Germany would help. But that takes time. That's not going to be fast. Nothing is quick. We have to be realistic about this. And I think that the United States, and there's a third part of this, which is important, which is, let's imagine there's a scenario where this happens, and some of the NATO countries immediately say that they're not going to help. Let's imagine, obviously, Hungary would not help, Slovakia would not help because of their current leadership. But imagine the United States said they weren't going to help. Imagine that the United States said, no, we're not going to get involved in this. That'd be disastrous for NATO. At that point, you've proven that it's a paper tiger. And that would also serve a purpose for Putin. And of course, domestically, this would be considered very positive to have defeated NATO at their own game in the eyes of the Russians. Is something that would gain Putin a lot of points with the FSB as well as with the military, who at this point are both very distraught and think frustrated with him because of the ongoing failures inside of Ukraine. So this gives him a domestic gain as well, as it would have a rally around the flag effect. What do you think?
So I think that there was a very interesting piece done by Bloomberg and their assessment of what a Russian invasion or assault would look like, and it seemed quite comprehensive that the Russians would be focusing on the Baltics, as you say, trying to sort of take out the weakest links, but then also using their remaining maritime assets in the Baltic Sea, and then also coming around north. But I do feel that it's a stretch if the Russians are struggling in Ukraine. And I mean, the Ukrainians just in the past 24 hours, you'll probably know, have said that they've stopped the Russians' offensive towards Sumy. Can we really sort of take at face value their ability to suddenly overwhelm the entirety of Europe? Granted, the big issue with NATO is that it is an alliance that requires coordination and support. Even if you've got a fraction of those nations working together, would that be sufficient to at least slow the Russian initial advances? I think one war game I read from CSIS was arguing that there would be a window of about 36 to 48 hours for the initial rapid deployment forces or whatever that exist up around the Baltics to stem the flow of the Russian advances. And then if there wasn't continued support from the United States and other sort of larger forces, then you would really see a breakdown in the command and control structure. So I think it does very much depend on the scenario. But what do you think?
I don't think that Russia would, as I said, I don't think there's any intention to actually start a war with NATO to
No, of
take
course
over.
not.
It's not the take land. It's not like Ukraine. It's quite a bit different. The objective is simply to create, distract, to create attention, and to two things, I guess, to distract all of Europe, who at that point have to arm itself and would have to worry about its own security ahead of Ukraine's security. And that, in the immediate effect, could actually really directly help Russia because without assistance coming from the Western countries, Ukraine would be in a very difficult position. But that aid is critical. Now, if you cut that off because these countries simply have to, at that point, prepare themselves, and it's very reasonable for them to do so, that would really be, I think, one of the very few ways that Putin could advance in Ukraine. Now, second to that, I think, is that it creates another problem or another positive in the eyes of Putin, is that this would also be something that would change the headlines. At that point, it's going to be, is there going to be a war between NATO and Russia? Who in the hell's going to be talking about Ukraine? Ukraine's going to be totally forgotten. And that's where he really wants to make a deal. Keep in mind, he was recently offering to negotiate with the Iranians and the Israelis. And behind that, of course, is Putin's interest of leveraging his contacts in the region to get a better deal with Ukraine. When he was talking to Trump, he was hoping that, I'll get a better deal on Ukraine. Because what happens really with Iran, he doesn't, I don't think, care about that as much. What he cares much more about is what happens in Ukraine. In the same case here, I think that if he said, listen, we're willing to stop this. This war has gotten too hot. Now it's already becoming confrontations with NATO, but we're willing to end this war. Let's just call it quits with whatever territorial claims he has inside of Ukraine. I think that there's a lot of people, especially on the American side, who might immediately accept that and just say, listen, this there's too much risk. This war has gotten too big, and it can just blow up further. We better end it now. I can totally imagine that happening. It's strategically, it works. I mean, if you look at like overall Russian theory about international relations, it fits into the paradigm of what they use. It's not something that's, I would say, foreign or unknown or never been heard of before. It's pretty standard. So I think that there is a very real way to imagine this going forward. I think that ultimately our countries have enough division in them already for Putin to realize that this is the sort of thing he needs. And there's a name for this, by the way. It's called the correlation of force in Soviet theory. But the correlation of force is essentially that when you're calculating total power between countries, the Soviet Union had no illusion that realistically its military was not as large as the NATO countries combined. It didn't have military strength. But you also have to look at other things. You have to look at economic resilience, ideological unity, and other things like this. So if you're able to strike down your enemy's ideological unity, for instance, or damage their economy, that operates as a positive because it's a cohesive force together.
But that's part of the reason why the summit in the past 2 days has been, if anything, a bit of a boost for NATO, because Trump has reaffirmed his, I want to be particular with my words here, understanding of its role. He came away paraphrasing, but he appreciated the love that each head of state and countries had for their respective countries, and therefore the role that NATO has in protecting them and upholding their prosperities. In that regard, he seemed to sort of like NATO. And I think we seem to have stepped back from this precipice of us seeing the potential complete withdrawal of the United States or severe defunding. I think Trump's going to still want to find ways to cut corners or cut the cost of being involved in NATO, maybe offhand more of those costs to some of the bigger players. Germany, I think, is coming to mind already. So I still think we're going to have a more diluted America in NATO, but certainly not to the most worst case scenario that you could have seen. I think he's lukewarm about it. He doesn't really care if it's there or not. I mean, Mark Carney was quick to point out that Trump has essentially given up on annexing or invading Canada. Greenland remains to be seen, but he seems to be falling back into a little bit more of a conventional line, right? More that you'd expect from quote unquote conventional establishment politicians. So that seems to be a positive. But are you essentially saying, therefore, that Russia's tactics are to divert attention and spread the European resources so much that they can get more in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, pretty much. Keep in mind, it's the other aspect of this is reflexive control, as it's called in the Soviet Union, which is sort of interesting because when you think about reflexive control, which is, I should define first, it was a Soviet doctrine, which Putin still obviously uses, of manipulating one's enemies and his perceptions in order that he will make decisions that serve your own goals. And that would be something like this. It'd be, for instance, how do I feed you enough information, false information, for instance, partial truths, or even real information but phrased in a way that helps me. So, for instance, the Baltic States, there really might be a Russian plan to do this. I mean, if the Russian intelligence services are warning, sorry, the Baltic States intelligence services are warning that there's a serious, real threat present to them, I don't think that they're just making that up. That's just not fear mongering. I think that they're probably basing that on something, just knowing how intelligence services operate, and knowing the fact that they would have to justify why they have these fears to other countries, in namely Germany, Poland, the United States, and so they can't just say, but it's Russia, it's bad. They have to come up with clear reasons. But let's imagine those clear reasons that they have, whatever that is, whether it's based upon their human intelligence sources, or if it's based upon their satellite information or their interception of phones. They have reason to believe, serious reason to believe, that Russia might try to invade some part of their country. Russia could also be the one behind trying to promote this and intentionally giving them bad information or making sure they get fed bad information, because it hopes at that point it will have this effect, that is to reprioritize what the West is doing so that it's not helping Ukraine and instead operating in Russia's interest, which is to not help Ukraine and to not support Ukraine with air support or air defense, sorry. I think that could be part of a strategy. And that is the way that ultimately we see the Soviet Union worked and we see that Russia works today. It's always been the same thing. I mean, I think that the more people study the Soviet Union and foreign policy, the more they realize that it's not changed at all. It's incredibly similar. It's incredibly homogeneous over this period of time. It's probably one of the easier countries to study. And I think what makes it interesting is that we don't study it. Well, many people think the Soviet Union's dead, so it's a waste of time. But secondly, I think we don't study it because we assume that other countries are like us, which is inherently a flaw. So we've discussed before the difference between perception and perspective. Perception is how you see things based upon your own experience, your own life. Perspective is how somebody else sees the world and how they see the situation. So we see Putin as a tyrant, and he's not going to do this because his country's weaker than the West, so he would never do that. But that's our perception. His perspective might be quite a bit different, which is that he views himself, let's imagine, as the leader of Russia, and he's not being motivated by what we think is like realist politics or something like this, some textbook. No, he's being guided by other things domestically. For instance, he's worried about coups. He's worried about unrest in the military. He's worried about the economic problems. And those are what precipitate his actions. It's not based upon what we see. We see it from a totally different angle. And so what he decides to do, even though we say it's rational, it's crazy. They said that with the invasion of Ukraine, and he did it. Because we view something as rational, it doesn't make it irrational. It's totally rational if it fits within the framework of normalcy for the other person. And what he views as a normalcy is quite a bit different, quite clearly, from what we view it as. We can never imagine how he views it. So we have to look more, I think, at his history, his historic choices. But then if you looked at those and you map them across what we know to be Soviet ideology and Soviet foreign policy, which he's very well versed in. I mean, he was a colonel in the KGB. He fits very well with that. I mean, the ideology works very well. We see him using Soviet ideology today.
I find that a bit bizarre, though, because Russia is not the Soviet Union, right? And it doesn't have the propensity to project power as far as the Soviet did, however erratically. So that sort of makes it quite remarkable that people do still treat Russia as the same level, even though it's quite clearly not when real push
Well,
comes to shove, as we saw.
it's not the same level. It's the same strategy that they use.
Same strategy, yeah.
So Russia, for instance, realizes that subversion from within a country is much cheaper than confrontation. That's why they tried to
Mm-hmm.
buy off the elections in Romania and Georgia and Moldova just recently. When you look at what's happened in the case of the African countries where they extract resources, namely Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, they've helped overthrow the governments there over the last few years, and it's very cheap. What's the total investment in that? The total investment's like nothing, and they get total control. Then they have their allies in Latin America, obviously Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. But globally, or let's look at Europe, they realize that they're not going to have countries that become pro-Russian. However, they can support political parties that are isolationist in nature, and that's very cheap because to win a parliamentary election in Europe, one is not very expensive, but two, um, you don't have to gain 51% of the vote. You only have to have 12, 15%. You could be a major player in any bloc in the parliament. And if that's the case, it's not hard to find 12 or 15% of a population that will vote for these parties that they support, who are either nationalist in ideology or isolationist in ideology. And by doing that, you can then have a player who's going to neutralize the country. Look at the country of Slovakia as an example. Slovakians in Poland are not extremely anti-Ukrainian or anything like that. However, the prime minister came to power because he promoted true rejection of globalization. That's what the population wanted. So I think that when you look at this overall, Russia's strategy actually makes a lot of sense. It's very inexpensive. It's much cheaper than what the U.S. is trying to do, or has tried to do historically, I should say, which is to promote democracy in other countries, for instance, trying to get countries to change. That's a very long and difficult process. However, getting countries simply to go your way in an election through supporting the various candidates, that's not very hard.
Absolutely no. Iran can do the same. You could draw an equivalence there between these two. They've both found very cost-effective ways, indirect, disruptive, covert methods by which to undermine leadership, governments, instead of the sort of full-on interventionary war state, nation state building that we've seen in the past by the Americans. Right, it cost what, 2 trillion for their attempted project in Afghanistan, and by extension, the Russians have spent, I don't know, I think it's like less than 1 billion across all of Africa in certain ways to try and influence things. And you've got a statue dedicated to the Wagner Group in Kar, if I remember correctly. Yeah, there is this. But it's not, the Russians are very good, I think, at leveraging a disenfranchisement with the existing government. But it's not necessarily because those people love Russia. It's just because Russia's very good at making it seem that that's what Russia represents to them. Taking those fears, taking those emotions, taking that grievance and leveraging it to their own self-interests, in a sense of like, hey, we understand this is how America's been treating you, or what you've had to deal with the French. Well, we can do a lot better and a lot simpler. We won't tell you how to live. We won't tell you how to govern. We won't tell you what you should be doing with X, Y, and Z. We don't, we're ready to work on your terms. And that appeals to a lot of people, even though ultimately there is still quite a lot of nefarious activity underneath the surface. But, where do you think this leaves us for the rest of the summer then? Because we've got, should we say, a fluid battleground. There is a lot of emphasis on Sumy at the moment and Pokrovsk. Do you think that we're going to see another sort of potential super summer offensive from the Ukrainians, for example, like we saw in Kursk? They do still technically control a little bit of territory in Russia. Do you think they're going to try and leverage that again?
And it's hard to say what they're going to do at this point, but I think that overall, if we're trying to understand what's happening, I think it's also a good example of how the war is misrepresented. Is we oftentimes talk about the Russians made gains in some oblast in eastern Ukraine. If you actually look at Google Maps and take a look at where these places are, a lot of the territory that Russia's taken over the past 6 months have been either farmland or villages that have been bombed out to oblivion. I mean, there's nothing left there. So it's not like there's people being taken into occupation when the Russians take over these destroyed villages. There's really just nothing there. So why are the Ukrainians then ceding territory to the Russians? And I think that that's very fundamental to understanding overall how the war is functioning, is that the Ukrainians are deciding to do that. It's a willful decision. Why? Because a war of attrition doesn't really benefit Ukraine. And free Ukraine, the non-occupied territories, there's only about 22 million people. Russia has about 145 million people. A war of attrition, as Russia would like to fight, which is historically fought with other countries, was successful because it's simply much larger. It could overwhelm any other country, even if they are just wasting men's lives, throwing them towards the machine gunners. Some men will finally get through and, Russia advances. But Ukraine can't do that. It's much smaller. So Ukraine has to cede territory with the understanding that one day it will get it back. Its objectives are quite a bit different. And that's what we see now is finally they're allowed to do more attacks within Russia. And that is changing things because now Russia has to reassign, for instance, air defense, reassign people to all different parts of Russia, a massive country of 11 time zones, to have to send men all over that country to protect it, to prevent something like the June 1st spiderweb attacks from reoccurring. It takes a lot of resources that really divides Russia well. And it's actually sort of the argument I made for why Putin would attack a Baltic state. It's the exact reasons why Ukraine is attacking across Russia. It changes everything. It does provide a paradigm shift. And given the state of the Russian economy, which is my great hope for how Russia collapses, I think that Vladimir Putin is becoming increasingly pressured by the situation. In fact, yesterday, the 26th of June, Bloomberg had a very good article talking specifically about how the Russian banking system is facing serious liquidity problems. And those liquidity problems are becoming abundantly clear. I mean, did you know that people who are defaulting, or who are, I should say, who are delinquent on their credit card debt for more than 90 days has soared more than 70% in the course of 4 months. Currently, 11% of people who have credit cards in Russia have defaulted on them or have stopped paying their bills. And the analysts in Russia say that this is just the beginning and it seems that it's accelerating. But where it's more interesting is the fact that there's repo auctions organized by the central bank for the actual banks in Russia, pumping billions of dollars into them weekly. Why? Because they lack liquidity and they're worried about a cascading effect as one bank sets off the next bank's collapse. There's too much bad debt in Russia. It's sort of similar to I guess the 2008 financial crisis in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to that where they're trading in bad debt. But at this point, the bad debt, there's much more of than the good debt. And the government itself is bankrupting its own suppliers. I mean, there was the day before yesterday, one of the largest microelectronic firms in Russia, the only one really that was producing microelectronics specifically for the military's MiGs, the Sukhois, the Tupolovs, went out of business. They went bankrupt. Why is it? Because the government was demanding to pay only about $33 per unit of these microchips. Sorry, I should say microelectronics. The going market value is about $48, and the government, so getting this huge discount, was getting it for cheaper than what it actually cost to produce. But second to that is that the government had an outstanding debt of $2 or $3 million that they just couldn't afford to pay, and so now they just simply won't have these microelectronics. And that's sort of stunning when you think about it. The Russian government, as massive as it is, didn't just cover that debt, knowing that it needs this, it's dependent on it, it has no other options. But look further, the Russian banks, so another contributing factor to why their banks are destroyed, is they have over $200 billion worth of loans that they were forced to give against their will to private military contractors and others that support the defense industry or offensive industry of Russia. And they're not able to get that money back. And because they can't get that money back, they're no longer solvent. And these are creating, once again, trickle down effect of one bad decision to the next bad decision. This can create a cascading effect of collapse, a systemic failure within the entire Russian economy. So I think that the current situation within Russia is much more complex than what we appreciate.
It is. I was watching with intrigue the International Economic Forum, 4 or 5 days ago, but quite clearly from the questions that were raised and just the sentiment, Putin's overall, I think, demeanor, a lot of emphasis was on a lot of things outside of Russia and the economics, by extension, being affected by the events in the Middle East. Clearly now that seems to settle down much. I think Putin's, it's torn. I think some of him welcomed it, another part of him didn't. But clearly the Russians do not have any appetite nor real capacity to support Iran, and that's effectively why they left them out to dry, right? And what's your assessment on where this goes in terms of Russia's relationship with the Iranians and their support to the Russian campaign in Ukraine?
Well, listen, so Russia's very funny in this. I think Iran, you and I have discussed before, is that Iranian and Russian relations historically weren't exactly great. They had 5 wars with each other in history. They fought over regions like Georgia and the Caucasus. But going ahead, Russian relations, I think, reached a positive, and they did work together historically. I mean, they fought the Ottoman Empire together. But if you go forward to the modern era, in 1979, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that's where you see Russia realizing that it could probably work with them, because obviously that revolution, it was not something the West was very excited by. The new government wasn't very pro-Western, and so Russia saw a window of opportunity. And still today, it sees a window of opportunity. Now, what this means in practical terms, I think that it's an opportunistic relationship. I don't think it's one built on actual love for each other. They are both sanctioned countries, so they have to deal in the black market together. They don't have access to normal systems. And so Russia is quite dependent on Iran for things such as the parts that are used in the drones. Yes, Shahed drones are manufactured in Russia, but that does not mean that all the parts and components are manufactured in Russia. They still import them. Hence why there's this huge industry of microchips that Russia is sanctioned from getting, and there's always a fight to prevent them from getting. But there's another aspect to this, which is the Iranians are the ones that are critical for Russia to be able to wash money from oil sales. The Iranians, thanks to being under sanctions for so many years, are really experts in this, and they've helped the Russians to do that. And that includes using the shadow fleet, how they transport oil to, say, the middle of an ocean, and they transport between ships the oil that they have, which is then shipped to other countries, and then the money, where it goes, how it gets washed. The Iranians help with all this. The Iranians are very active in helping them. So I think that this is a setback for Russia. At the same time, Vladimir Putin does view this as a positive. Why? Because this is, again, or he did when there's an active war going on with Iran, he views it as something that is distracting the West. Remember when there's October 7th attacks in Israel? On October 23rd, who came to Moscow, if not the leadership of Hamas? Why did the Kremlin invite them there? It's because it knew that the October 7th attacks did more than anything else to distract the world from Ukraine. And actually, I think it never really recovered from there. Ukraine was always a top news story up until then, and it sort of declined. Because I think that Putin realized there was a way to leverage the situation. And that's, I think, one thing that the Russians, I'd give them credit for, is they are always looking how to angle everything in a very clever way. How do they leverage things where they don't actually have an upper hand? They're not in a great situation, but they leverage it. I mean, the country is smaller economically than Italy, and yet it does have a global influence much greater than Italy's. And that's because it focuses so much on clearly trying to leverage everything it has for its end-all national, what it defines as its national interest, which I think is actually not. I think it hurts their own people, but that's a different story. What do you think?
Oh, well, I think Well, I think that it clearly emphasizes that economic size is not everything. It's what you do with the hand you're dealt with, and the Russians are very good with that. And whether you like it or not, especially under Vladimir Putin, the Russians have had this capacity to still be considered a great power, whilst in the eyes of people who follow it or are more strict in their definitions will certainly argue against that. The Russians do have this capacity to interfere, influence across the world in ways, yes, it has to be, I think, a little bit more selective than, say, the Chinese or the Americans, but they are very good at still being considered amongst the eyes of people who see them as a beacon of, anti-Western or whatever movements that they are strong on. Again,
Well,
we can
it
talk about
yes.
Africa and things, isn't it?
No, you're absolutely right, and it's actually we've discussed this before as well. But I study obviously the former Soviet states, but there's another region which I study, which I would say I'm equally as fluent in the language of, which is Latin America. So I'm a Latin
Mm.
American specialist as well. When you look at Latin America, it shows a lot of parallels to actually Africa in development and a lot of other things, but specifically to Russia. Russia uses today the exact same narratives that it did in the Soviet period. So one thing that I specifically look at and singular, not singular, my strongest focus in Latin America is leftist movements, popular leftist movements today in Latin America. And what you notice about them is that even the word choice, it's exactly the same as the Soviet Union. And you talk about we have to stop the colonialists, or they believe the CIA is behind everything, or that Operation Condor, they talk about a lot, which is the operation in the U.S. under Nixon to assassinate Latin American socialists and things like this. But anyways, that was 50 years ago, and yet today they seriously believe that there's a new Operation Condor by the CIA, and the Russians are just neutral arbitrators trying to help them out to be liberated from American imperialism and colonialism. And it's sort of interesting. And I've talked to lots of people who have this belief. I mean, there's plenty of people. I know I have hundreds of them I've spoken with, and it's amazing to me how much they really believe it. And even people who are elected officials. I mean, I'm talking at a very senior levels of elected officials, and they really believe it. But second to that, they are ignorant of usually Soviet history about really the murderous man who was Lenin, and they also downplay or ignore Che Guevara, for instance, was also a murderer. They don't like to talk about that as much. Or I would argue he's an imperialist. Keep in mind the guy was born in Argentina, was being financed by Cubans, and he died in Bolivia trying to interject himself into a revolution there. But I digress. So neither here nor there. When we look at all this, one thing I find to be amazing is that though they use a lot of active measures, another Soviet term, which is to try to create change or try to achieve a physical objective in a different country. In this case, we realize that Russia today, for instance, or Sputnik, though they have like no following in the West, like no one in the United States, I think would ever cite Sputnik or Russia Today as a serious source. I think you'd be laughed at. But in Latin America, it's considered to be totally legitimate. I mean, it's like citing, Voice of America, which is not propaganda. Well, no longer exists, but I've been on Voice of America plenty of times. I've criticized the U.S. government on Voice of America. Nobody tells you not to. Nobody tells you to stop. Nobody gives you guidance. You can say whatever you want. The objective being the theory that the Americans had was that by providing true information to people, accurate information, diverse views, people will naturally come to the right conclusions and realize how it contrasts with the lies that the government tells them. And that's why they have no problem if you want to say something against the U.S. government or you want to criticize the policy. Why? Because they realize that it shows that it's legitimate, unlike their own government back in whatever closed society. Now, the Russians don't have that. Voice of Russia Today, RT, or Sputnik, they are just propaganda. It's just BS what they tell people. And yet they're cited as legitimate sources all the time. And Russia's doing this perennially, constantly, I mean, around the world. And how much does it cost? It costs nothing. It's absolutely so cheap. And you would be amazed to see on the American side how reticent they are to even touch things like this. I mean, I tell you, because I work in the field, it is shocking to me that the Americans are so naive, and I work with them, or I have worked with them on this, is to say something publicly that could be perceived negatively or perceived as being against Russia's interest or doing. They don't want to touch anything because they view it as a high risk. The Russians, this is bread and butter. This is 7 days a week they work on it. So I think it's sort of interesting the different perspectives of how we approach these things. But what do you think?
Well, I think that it's going back to what we said before. The Russians don't have the ability to go toe to toe with the Americans on exactly the same way, but they do have very good mechanisms, tools, disinformation. That's why they are seen as the what sort of pin-up boy, poster child of modern day disinformation, propaganda, misdirection, deception, all these things to covertly influence people. Look at the group of influencers which were levied by them to or influence the narrative around the election. Tim Pool and others, that revelation that came out earlier in the year. China does the same with its own form of influencer agents, this concept whereby, you don't have to get people to be reporting back to you, but they can actually be in the government influencing policy directly. So it's a sort of a different form of spy and espionage, if you like. And with the role of, social media, as we are talking on right now, very much the case. So we could go on, but I know we are short on time, Jason, and we could talk about, I think, many aspects of Russia, the former Soviet Union, and Putin. But we can always reconvene, because I'm sure we'll have more time to have you back in the future. But thank you so much for sharing your latest thoughts with us, and I look forward to doing it again as well. And as always, everyone, enjoyed the conversation. Do subscribe, do like the video, and take care.